Hello, Peter4789 here, and for today, I'll be reviewing Bloodborne. Now, being a relatively big fan of the Souls games, I played Demon Souls and both the Dark Souls games, I was pretty interested in seeing what Bloodborne had to offer. Bloodborne still looks like it had the same style of gameplay that the Soul game has, though still being a different beast of its own to differentiate it from the other Souls games. And having played through it with two different builds, and on one build through New Game Plus twice, and on the second build going through New Game Plus once, I thought I should give my thoughts on it. So, how does Bloodborne hold up? Is it a good game? Does it compare to other Souls games? Well, let's find out by starting this review of Bloodborne. Bloodborne is an action RPG that was developed by FromSoftware and published by Sony. It is only available for the PS4, well, at this time. And do note this review is based on my experience from having played Bloodborne from around June, so if there was any new patches that came, this review isn't probably going to cover them.
Well, you've come to the right place. Yharnam is the home of blood ministration. You need only unravel its mystery. But where's an outsider like yourself to begin?
Let's first talk about the visual presentation. I think Bloodborne does a great job in these departments. Firstly, I think the animation are pretty good, with it being pretty fluid as well as feeling that each attack you do with each weapon in the game feels weighty but satisfying. And the visceral attack animation is also pretty awesome to witness. I also think the various special effects looks great, especially the phantasm attacks you see from the arcane spells. Now, Bloodborne is probably not the most graphic intensive game out of the market, but I do have to add that I really like the dark Victoria London art style that is intertwined with Lovecraft. It does a great job of conveying an eerie, creepy, and threatening atmosphere, as well as an ambience of mystery and madness within the visuals you see in the city of Yharnam, to the point that it's really interesting to go explore the city in the game. You really want to see what's up with the city. You want to know the history of how Yharnam got to its state. You really want to see what could be up next, which really does make you get more immersed into the lore of Bloodborne. And to add, I do think Bloodborne does a great job of making Yharnam, the city itself, feel real, with each area you are traversing through feeling like it's part of Yharnam, but still feel distinct and interesting. Each area feel cohesive to each other, but still feel like they have their own history to it. This is in part to the visual style of the game, but also due to the interconnectedness you see in the world of Bloodborne. Whether by seeing the areas you are going to visit or have already visited in the distance, seeing how these different areas are connected to each other, and of course the interconnectedness is also really helped by the visual style of Bloodborne, by making it still feel like this is one city, even though the area are distinct from each other. And in terms of the audio presentation side of things on Bloodborne, it's done marvelous as well. The sound effects themselves sound great. As for the actual music that plays in Bloodborne, there's not much music actually played when you're traversing through the levels outside the sound effects, but that really does work to its advantage, as it does build up atmosphere, as I mentioned before, and really does get you sucked into the game. Then it does help give you audio cues in the gameplay department when you're going through the levels when you are really paying attention. Though there is music that plays during the boss fights, those tracks are really good and does match with each theme that each boss is going for, from boss tracks to try to put an emphasis on when you're fighting a beastly monstrosity, to the more alien and creepy tracks that play when you fight the more cosmic and Lovecraftian creatures that you fight in the game. Each boss track fit each boss perfectly and are really good tracks. The voice acting is also good, though there's really no lip syncing at all, like the past Souls games. Now to talk about the story of Bloodborne. Bloodborne, like most other Souls games, follow a different type of storytelling, with it being much more minimalistic than most games, with most of the game's lore is hidden within item descriptions, several notes you find as you progress the game, NPC dialogue, even if brief, the visuals of the environment, and even the few cutscenes within the game itself, with players really having to piece things together to get the full picture. So what do I think about the story and lore of Bloodborne? Well, from what I've seen and heard both in-game and in the community, it's really interesting. I won't say anything more, but there's one thing I've really enjoyed from my time, and it's really the atmosphere. I really love the atmosphere in this game. Now to discuss the gameplay of Bloodborne. Structurally, Bloodborne does share elements from both Dark Souls and Demon Souls world structure, with Bloodborne having an interconnecting level design, with you finding various paths to connect you back to past areas, as well as there being numerous shortcuts throughout the levels that lead you back to your lamppost, which is basically a Bloodborne version of Bonfire, and are basically a checkpoint system of sort, which overall rewards you to go and explore the levels. But there's also a hub of sorts like Demon Souls Nexus called the Hunter's Dream, which you can access to with your lamppost, with you being able to use your blood echoes, which is the main currency in the game that you earn in battle or by using various items, to level up your character there. But do note that you do need your first insight in order to level up, upgrade your weapons as well as repair them, and buy items. But the downside to using the Hunter's Dream is that all the enemies respawn when you go back to the area you were before you went to the Hunter's Dream. There's also an insight shop that unlocks after you get 10 insight, where you can use the insight you gain to buy certain useful items. The insight system can also make the game more difficult. With the more insight you get, the stronger enemies get, with some of them getting visible buffs. Now structurally, I think Bloodborne is done extremely well. The level design is fantastic, with the level design requiring you to pay attention to your surroundings to advance, as well as each area in the game feeling very unique to each other, with each area level design being different enough from each other to keep you on your toes, but not too different that feels out of place. And this is done both by the environmental hazards you encounter in these areas, as well as the enemy variety and placement. The level design also encourages you to explore the area more, with there being a good amount of shortcuts that link back to the lamppost, as I said before, and they are scarcely placed, with there being enough of them and enough shortcuts that you do feel you are making progression by making use of them, while not too little or too much that it cheapens the experience. Linking the HUD-like system via the Hunter's Dream to the lamppost is also done extremely well, with you being able to adequately prepare for the challenge ahead with the facilities that the Hunter's Dream provide you, but it is also extremely fair about it. The insight system is also an interesting way to increase the difficulty of the game that ties to the lore of the game, and the increased difficulty is noticeable. But there is one fault in Bloodborne's level design, and that is the chalice dungeons. The level design in the chalice dungeons are really boring, as well as there not being enough deviation between the level design in them. Most of the time, they're generally the same levels but with different visual effects to differentiate which chalice dungeons you're going into. They may be visually different, but mechanically, there's not much difference, which is pretty disappointing. Now to get to the combat of Bloodborne. Now Bloodborne does contain the framework of the Soul game's combat, but the game does having an emphasis on methodical combat, where you do have to pay attention to how your enemy attacks and act accordingly, as well as pay attention to the environments and knowing how much to attack, but also knowing when to go on the defensive. But Bloodborne is designed with putting more emphasis on being offensive and having a much faster flow to the combat, with the speed of the combat being dramatically faster. There being a lot more emphasis on dodging, with the standard roll is replaced with a fast dash when you're targeting that allows you to go from the defensive to offensive much quicker than a roll from the past games, though the roll is still in there if you press O untargeted. There are also no shields except for the wooden one, which isn't really useful for blocking most attacks in the game. There's also a regain system that really emphasizes the offensive nature of Bloodborne, which is basically a system where you can regain lost health if you get hit by the enemy. If you hit the enemy back fast enough, with the amount of health you get back is proportional to how much damage you can deal in a small time frame. The maximum amount of health you can gain back is indicated by the orange bar, but the regain system works on a hit-to-hit basis. So if you get hit while trying to regain your health back, or if the enemy is comboing you, you will lose some health that you can't gain back with the regain system, but the only way to recover is using blood vials, or using some rune special effects. And the mechanic overall can serve as a risk and reward system, since you can lose even more health if you're too gung-ho about regaining your health, since you do run the risk of getting maimed by the enemy if you're not paying attention to their moveset and just trying to spam attack to regain your health. And not to mention that all of the enemies are designed around the faster flow and aggressive nature of the combat. And if you wait too long, you won't gain back the lost health, but if you time it right, you'll be able to reap the benefits of the regain system. The parry mechanic also changed to match the fast pace and aggressive nature of Bloodborne in the form of guns. Now the guns aren't only limited to parrying, but that is their main function, with you being able to parry certain enemies right if you shoot as the enemy attacks. With the payoff being able to pull off an incredibly powerful attack called a visceral attack when the enemies are in a stunned state from the parry. But do note that you do have a limit to how many bullets you can carry. But you can also replenish bullets by using your health. How you regain your lost health is also different, with there being a traditional potion system with you being able to carry a maximum of 20 blood vials, with the access being sent to storage. But there is a dedicated button to using potions, which does fit the aggressive nature of Bloodborne, with you being able to pop a potion when it is needed, without having to scramble through your inventory to get the potion. The weapons are also slightly different, with the trick weapon mechanic, which basically allow every weapon you get in the game to transform. That will change the moveset dramatically. Well, some weapons transform more than others, but anyway. Which essentially means that each trick weapon in the game have two movesets to them that complement each other well, with each trick weapon being really different from each other and really fun to use. The bloodstain mechanic is still largely the same, with you leaving a bloodstain if you die, which also means you lose your blood echoes, which is the main currency in the game, but you do have a chance to get them back if you can get to where you die and activate the bloodstain, which will allow you to regain your blood echoes. But there's one twist that Bloodborne adds. Enemies can get your blood echoes, which means you have to, if that happens, you have to slay the enemy that have your blood echoes, which does make things interesting. Overall, I really dig the combat. It's noticeably really different from the Soul games, and if you play Bloodborne like you do the Soul games, you're gonna be killed. A lot. Though the reverse is also true. But even though it is very different, Bloodborne still retains the core aspect of what made the Soul games combat engaging, while trying to be its own unique beast. Each weapon moveset are still really fun and useful to use, as well as their being really different from each other. The combat is really engaging, with the combat being fast-paced, but also still keeping the methodical nature of the Soul games combat intact, with you having to pay heavy attention to the type of enemy you face, as well as your surroundings, as well as knowing your trick weapon strength and weaknesses, knowing when to go on the offensive and defensive, though with emphasis on the offensive this time, knowing when the right time to parry, which overall makes the combat incredibly satisfying to grow through. And if you don't do these things, you will die. A lot. But the game also encourages you to learn from your mistakes with the bloodstain mechanic, which overall makes the challenge in Bloodborne unrelenting at times, but still fair due to both the bloodstain mechanic as well as the level design. I also think the regain system is fair, even though it is a system that lets you recover some HP from a hit. And I do think it's fair with how easy it is to be killed in Bloodborne, with how relentless the enemies are in the game, as well as there being a limit of how much you can regain your health, since the regain system does work on a hit-to-hit basis. So if you get hit too many times, you won't be able to recover all your HP. You're going to have to pop a blood vial to recover if you get hit too many times. And not to mention that the time frame for needing to make use of the regain system is fairly short, which does really make it fair. And the regain system overall does emphasize the offensive nature of Bloodborne, but it doesn't take out the methodical aspect of it as well. The parry system is also interesting, with there being a lot more emphasis on parries this time around, with the game encouraging you to know the enemy moveset to counter them with a well-timed shot to parry them, and when you do parry enemies, the parries are generally satisfying to pull off, with the parry system not being too overpowered with the limited amount of blood bullets you get. And it is especially satisfying to pull off a parry at a boss and to visceral attack them. And to note, there is a magic system on Bloodborne, though the magic uses blood bullets, and I can't really comment on it as well since I haven't done arcane build. Bosses are also incredible, with each of them being unique from each other and are really fun and intense to fight against. And the enemy variety is fantastic, with each enemy type requiring different strategies to deal with them effectively, even though Bloodborne does reuse some enemy types later on in the game. But anyway, combine the enemy variety and enemy placement with the level design, and Bloodborne is extremely well designed in the combat department. But not everything works as well as it could, or at least I think so. For one, I think that one encounter in the game is extremely unfair, which is the bloody cruel caners. He's really cheap. But moving on that, I think a significant problem that I noticed when I was playing through the game is the camera on some of the bosses. Now, I'm used to camera issues in action games, but it can be pretty bad at times when facing giant bosses, where there are times when you can't see what the bosses are doing in certain instances, which can spell disaster. And in comparison to the other Soul games, I probably ran into camera issues more in this game. But still, the camera issue isn't too bad in the grand scheme of things. On the PvP and co-op side of things, I can't really say much since I don't do much of it, but I am saddened to hear that there is not a seed of the giant type of item in Bloodborne, cause that item was awesome in Dark Souls 2. Would have loved that in Bloodborne. Now to talk about the progression and customization side of Bloodborne. Now, Bloodborne's leveling system is similar to the Soul game's leveling system, with you using the blood echoes you earn for battle, using specific items to level up your stats, with the catch being that for every stat you increase, the cost of blood echoes for the next level up would increase, which overall does make you think which stats you should increase, which does make it an engaging leveling system, with you feeling stronger if you level up wisely, from having to choose if you want to get more health or endurance, to choosing which offensive stat you want to increase that would benefit the trick weapon you are using most in terms of the weapon stat scaling. It is overall a very well done system. The one thing that Soul fans might take issue with though is that Bloodborne doesn't really have much build variety in comparison to the other Soul games. There is variety in playstyle in terms of the different amount of trick weapons and their movesets in the game, as well as the guns, but in terms of build variety, there's not much to offer to veteran Soul players, which can limit replayability in terms of starting a new character and getting that character to focus on new stats that would change the playstyle. There's not as much of that in Bloodborne as there was in the Soul games. There is build variety in Bloodborne, but not as much as in the Soul games, which can hurt Bloodborne longevity to longtime Soul fans. Now to talk about the customization side of things, it's pretty standard. There's a variety of trick weapons and armor pieces you equip. Now there's not as much things to equip in Bloodborne, but there's still variety to be had. Well, at least for the different amount of trick weapons you can use and equip, since each trick weapon are really different from each other. Armor, on the other hand, well, armor doesn't matter as much as you would expect in an RPG. What I mean by that is that there's not an armor set that's like vastly superior to another armor set, except perhaps the first set you get, which you already got equipped. Some armor pieces are certainly more useful in certain situations for the different resistance stats they have against certain attacks, but I wouldn't say there's like a steady progression of gear to go through that makes you feel stronger in terms of the armor in Bloodborne. You can also upgrade your weapons in the Hunter's Dream, which is a pretty standard upgrading system, with you getting certain items and blood echoes to upgrade your weapon, as well as equipping different blood gems that will increase your weapon effectiveness with various different effects. The weapon upgrading system is a standard progression upgrading system, with you feeling good progression from using the system, but the system doesn't really change how your weapon function. Lastly, there's the rune system. At about early to midpoint of the game, after defeating an optional boss, the Witch of Hemlock, you will have access to the rune workshop, where you'll be able to equip a maximum of 4 runes, though the 4th rune slot are reserved for special runes that you get through NPC questlines. And these special runes are generally better than the normal runes that you collect normally throughout the rest of the game. And talking about runes give you various beneficial effects that will increase your effectiveness in battle. Now, most of these effects are rather typical in an RPG, but the magnitude of these effects do make you feel stronger. Overall, the progression system is rather good, with Bloodborne leveling system being really engaging, with you having to be wise in your allocation of stats upgrades, with the payoff being satisfying. As well as the weapon upgrading system, if typical, still feels like a good progressional system for upgrading your weapons. In terms of the customization side of things, there is a variety of playstyle to be had in equipping different type of trick weapons, and all the trick weapons are all viable, which is great. Though I wouldn't really say equipping different type of armor in this game changed the game all that much. And lastly, the build variety in Bloodborne can be a tad disappointing to longtime Soul fans. And now to talk about the difficulty, since people talk about the Soul games and Bloodborne likes to talk about its difficulty. So, how hard or difficult is Bloodborne? It's on par with other Soul games, which is to say, they're difficult for sure, but I find the games to be more punishing for making mistakes rather than outright difficult. And I do personally think that the Soul game's difficulty is over exaggerated at times. But then again, I have come through 3 Soul games, so my opinion might be a bit skewed. But for people who are wondering if Bloodborne is harder than the other Soul games, it depends. I mean, it's not really fair comparing the difficulty of Bloodborne and the other Soul games, since they play vastly different from each other, even though they do have the same framework. But if you were to ask me anyway, I think the enemy mobs is tougher in Bloodborne than some of the other Soul games, with some exceptions, but I do feel some of the bosses are tougher in the other Soul games, barring Dark Souls 2 bosses. Though again, with some exceptions, since Bloodborne do have some really tough bosses that do match for the best of the Soul game bosses. And overall, the difficulty on Bloodborne is on par with other Soul games in general, except for Dark Souls 2. Oh, and let's briefly talk about New Game Plus. Now, New Game Plus starts right away after beating the game, and the difference in New Game Plus is mostly stat differences. But there's not really much differences of enemy types or enemy locations. It's mostly just stat differences. That does make New Game Plus still challenging, even though you are carrying everything from New Game into New Game Plus. Oh, almost forgot about Chalice Dungeons. Now, I touched upon the Chalice Dungeons lightly earlier in the review when talking about their level design flaw, but I didn't really go that much in depth in it. Chalice Dungeons are, in a nutshell, optional dungeons that you can gain access to by getting certain chalices, which you get by defeating optional bosses in Bloodborne. And you'll be able to go to these chalice dungeons by using the chalice themselves, of course, as well as using certain material, and you basically be using the chalice and the material at a tombstone in the Hunter's Dream. Now, the chalice dungeons themselves have a few new enemies and bosses that you won't encounter in the main game, as well as the difficulty of the chalice dungeons being set in stone, and with the difficulty not being affected by the New Game Plus cycles. As for my thoughts on them, why I may not be too hot about the level design in the chalice dungeons, I do like the bosses and enemies that you face in them. Well, the new bosses you face. Most of them. But unfortunately, in terms of enemy variety and boss variety, The challenge dungeons sadly do reuse a good amount of bosses in them. Now, the challenge dungeons don't reuse the mandatory bosses, but they do reuse the optional bosses that you had to fight in order to gain access to the challenge dungeons in the first place. Heck, some enemy normal mobs are even treated as bosses in some of the challenge dungeons, which can be seen as kind of lazy. So I'm half-half on them. I like going through them the first time just to see some of the new enemies and bosses, but I can still see that the challenge dungeons are kind of lazily designed, just because of the poor level design in them, as well as the reuse of bosses and even treating a normal enemy type as a boss. Now, this is my experience from doing the normal chalice and one of the defiled chalices, and I haven't really tried the root version of the chalices, with the difference being is that the root version are basically randomized dungeons. Overall, Bloodborne is a great and fun game. The world that Bloodborne presents that mixes the Victorian London setting with Lovecraftian is dark, mysterious, interesting, and has a great atmosphere of dread and madness and mystery that will really immerse and engage you in the game's world. The combat is also engaging and will really keep you on your toes, and it was able to take the core aspect of what made the Soul game's combat appealing to longtime Soul fans, but still able to make it its own beast with its combat mechanics, and combine this with the enemy design, level design, as well as having fantastic boss fights and having good progressional systems. And Bloodborne is just a great game to sink your teeth in gameplay wise. It also have good production values, and I just had a blast with Bloodborne. Now, there are some problems that do drag the experience in Bloodborne, and Bloodborne itself is not a game for everybody, but overall, Bloodborne is one of the best games I played on the PlayStation 4